Hi, my name is Dayna Caves. I am a registered dietitian and I work at Smithville Medical Center Family Health Team. I've partnered up with West Lincoln Public Library in Smithville to be able to answer questions our community members have about diet. So today I have a question that comes from Lori, and I'm going to read it off. It says, all of my adult life, I've had low blood pressure. However, the past couple of years, my blood pressure has been steadily increasing to high levels over 200. I eat well and exercise moderately by regularly walking my dogs. I am about 15 pounds overweight. I believe the high blood pressure is due to an overwhelming amount of stress. Are there vegan foods that are particularly good at lowering blood pressure? Any foods I should be avoiding? So great question, Lori. First, I just kind of want to explain what is high blood pressure. So a simple explanation of what high blood pressure is when the force of the blood is pushing on the blood vessels walls are too high. And it basically ends up leading to having your heart having to work harder, which eventually leads to heart disease. It's a very serious condition, so high blood pressure isn't something that should be ignored, as it has been linked with being the #1 risk factor for stroke and a major risk factor for heart attacks. So a normal blood pressure would be a value of 120 over 80, whereas that top number, the 120, that's your systolic blood pressure value. And what that is when your heart contracts. So it's the pressure in your arteries when your heart contracts, whereas the bottom number, or the 80, is the diastolic value, and that's the pressure in your artery walls when your heart relaxes. So someone with a blood pressure read of 140 over 90 is considered to be at very high risk of having a stroke or a heart attack. Lori, if your blood pressure reads at home have been showing that your systolic blood pressure have been consistently high, above 200, then that is considered very elevated, and it definitely warrants immediate assessment by your doctor. So I'd want you to go see your healthcare provider to have that assessed. There are lots of factors that can impact your blood pressure. Stress, smoking, alcohol intake, activity, and diet all impact your blood pressure. As a dietitian, I'm going to focus today on diet, but Lori, if you feel like stress has been a major contributor to your blood pressure, then it's really important that you go see your healthcare provider to find ways that you'd be able to lower your stress levels so that it's not impacting your blood pressure. So in terms of evidence, the best amount of evidence that we have for a diet that can help lower your blood pressure is one called the DASH diet. The DASH diet it stands for the Dietary Approach to Stop Hypertension. And a great resource to find out more information on this would be the Canadian Heart and Stroke Foundation. On their website, they do have a good explanation of what the DASH diet is. But today I'm just going to summarize what the key points are about this diet. So I'd say the #1 features of the diet would be, #1 would be that it's very low in sodium. And another word for sodium is salt. So the diet is very low in salt. It's very high in fiber, particularly high in soluble fiber. It's very low in saturated fats, and the feature about this diet of what makes it so low in saturated fat is that it has a very low intake of red meats. So red meats are meats coming from cows, pigs, lambs, and goats. And the diet features more coming from fish, skinless poultry, and choosing low-fat dairy like 0, 1%, or 2% milk products. And the other part is that it has a decreased intake of processed or refined foods. So it's lower in processed foods or refined sugars that could be found in foods such as cakes, cookies, candies, chocolate, drinks, sugary drinks like soda pops, or juice punches, things like that, fruit punches, fruit beverages, stuff like that, and sugars added to your coffees and teas. So the diet really encourages you to have a lowered intake from that. And then the other part about it is that it features making sure that you have several times a week nuts and seeds or dried legumes. So black beans, kidney beans, lentils, chickpeas, things like that, and more nuts and seeds, all nuts and seeds, but of course unsalted versions of these. And then lastly, the hallmark component of the diet is that fats are included in the diet, but it's plant-based fats, so things like olive oil instead of butter, lard, shortening, things like that. And it's in small quantities, so it's not in very large amounts. So the differences between a vegan diet and a DASH diet, as you've heard, is that the DASH diet does contain animal products, whereas a vegan diet doesn't contain animal products. The key thing, though, to know is that just because it is vegan doesn't mean that the diet isn't free of other things that can raise your blood pressure. So yes, it doesn't have animal products that would be high in saturated fats, but there definitely could have some things that have lots of sodium. So my main focus would be to look at label reading for sodium. The studies have shown that if we cut back our sodium intake to 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams a day, it can drop your blood pressure by 11 points on the top number, so the systolic value, and as much as 5 points on the diastolic or bottom value within a month of sticking to lower sodium eating, which is pretty impressive when you think about it. So when reading the label, so in Canada, to make label reading a little bit easier, they've decided to put the percentage daily value on the right-hand column. So when you look at a product, so I've got Hunt's no salt added tomato sauce, you'll look for the sodium and you'll scroll across and look at the daily value. And so in this case, for a quarter of a cup, it has 1% of your daily intake of sodium. So in Canada, what they do to try to help you identify what's considered a lot or a little is anything that has 15% or more of a nutrient is considered a lot, and anything that has 5% or less is considered a little. So in this case, at 1% for sodium, that's considered very little sodium. So this would be a good product to choose. As a comparison, salsa, for example, so in this case, in this salsa product, for the same serving size, so about a quarter cup, the sodium is 7%. So this would be in the kind of gray area or the in-between range, or what I call the caution range. Okay, so 15% or more, think of that as like the red light stop. Yellow light would be anywhere between the 5 and 15%, and green light would be anything 5% or less. So this product would be considered a yellow light or a caution food. So what I would do when you're having those kinds of foods is see what you can do to cut it back in terms of the amount of salt. So something you could do is add some diced tomatoes, like canned no salt added diced tomatoes, to help thin the quantity coming from the saltier product, but still making it something tasty to have. So the things that you want to kind of pay attention to, the top sources, where do we get salt in our diet? Yes, of course, you could add it when you're cooking. So there's sodium that you could add when you're cooking. So that would you'd want to cut back on. But the main the main components of what provides Canadians the highest source of sodium comes from our packaged foods. So top 5 in Canada, or top 6 in Canada, baked goods like our breads, buns, muffins, cookies, and crackers. This could be in a vegan diet as long as it didn't have butter, eggs, or dairy products being used to make them. So the key thing I'd be looking at is, before you put it in your cart at the grocery store, is to check the label for the sodium and make that decision about whether it's a good choice for you to have or not. Appetizers and entrees that you find in the freezer section. So yeah, sure, maybe it's a vegetarian lasagna using vegan cheese, but it could still be very high in sodium. So you'd want to check that. A black bean burger sounds like it would be healthy, but it could have lots of salt. So this is why it's important to try to choose less prepackaged foods and make the foods at home yourself. Processed meats provide a lot of the sodium in Canadians' diets. So in a vegan diet, you wouldn't have any of those, but there are vegan alternatives. Again, black bean burger, it could be like the tofu fake chicken nuggets, it could be tofu ground round, things like that. So those could all have a serious high amount of sodium, so you'd want to check the package. Cheese represents a large amount of sodium in the Canadian diet, so same thing, vegan cheese. I'd be checking those labels and looking at it and seeing if you can find a lower choice, and if you can't, then that would be one that I wouldn't be having very often at all. And then lastly, canned soups, sauces, and condiments. As I showed you, this is a good choice, but if I didn't buy a no salt added version, then canned tomato sauce usually represents a fair amount of sodium in our diet. I do have an example of a canned sauce. So this is a mild curry paste, and it's unfortunately really high in sodium. So for 2 tablespoons, it represents 26% of my day's intake of salt. So in this instance, what I would be recommending is see if you can cut back the amount that you're going to use in a recipe, and then find other ways to flavor the recipe. So in this case, if it was curry, I'd be looking for like an unsalted curry powder. You could do cumin or turmeric or something like that, add more of those ingredients in there, and that would give flavor to your dish to replace the lost amount from the curry paste. So there's lots of products out there that you want to look at. So instead of using salted versions, try to choose the no salt versions. Instead of using salt to flavor your foods, could you use herbs and spices and spice blends that are salt-free, like Mrs. Dash, for example. And then things that I try to do to add flavors to my dishes: onions, garlic, fresh, like chopped things at the end. So like chopped green onions or chives at the end of the dish, or using orange zest or lemon zest or lime juice, orange juice, like squeeze, it out. Those are all great ways to flavor your foods without having to use salt. The second part that I'd be thinking about on a vegan diet and trying to make it more like the DASH diet is being mindful of your fat choices. So sure, you're not getting butter or lard or shortening in butter or lard in your diet, but you could still have shortening because that could be a vegan source. You could also have palm oil, palm kernel oil, or coconut oil, and these are all high sources of saturated fats. So the key part about the DASH diet is it's not very high in saturated fat. So same thing about looking on the label for the sodium. You want to look on the label for saturated fats, and you want to look at the percentage there, and the same thing applies. 15% or more is a lot, 5% or less is a little. So you'll notice that coconut oil is very high in saturated fats. So instead of using coconut oil, I'd be recommending that you use something like olive oil, sesame oil, avocado oil, canola oil, peanut oil. These are all good lower saturated fat plant oils that would be healthy for you. Key thing though is to be mindful of your portions, and that's the key component of the DASH diet, is that it's not using a lot of it, it's watching its portions. So olive oil, good for me. A liter of olive oil a day, maybe not so good for me. So just be mindful of your portions. And then I would say lastly, like the major component of the DASH diet and why it's so helpful to help lower your blood pressure is that it's very high in fiber coming from fruits, veggies, whole grains, nuts and seeds, and legumes. So unfortunately, I've had patients who've been said that they're vegan, or friends and family members that are vegan, and you ask them about their eating habits, and they're not eating whole grains, and they're eating white grains, or they're not having legumes in their diet very often. So the things that I'd be looking at is making sure you're choosing the whole grains. So be mindful of marketing out there where they'll have like a white bread product and it will say with added fiber. Studies have shown that modifying or synthesizing the fiber and adding it back into the product is not as beneficial for your heart as by having it in its native form. So don't fall victim to marketing, and instead choose the whole grain, heavy grain, mixed grains. So like the 12 grain, 20 grain breads, whole grain pastas. Other whole grains could be things like your barley, steel cut oats, quinoa, bulgur, things like that. These are all excellent whole grains that you want to be having. With the fruits and veggies, you want to be getting lots of those. So every time you're eating your meal, look at your plate and think, okay, I've got to have half my plate coming from my fruits and veggies, and that would fit the DASH diet and still remain vegan. And then lastly, you mentioned your weight, that you're overweight. And although you're right that weight gain can have an impact on our blood pressure, there's a good amount of evidence that if you change your eating habits with no weight loss, that you still can lower your blood pressure substantially. Other things that I'd be encouraging is looking at trying to increase your activity levels. So it's the aerobic exercise where you get your heart pumping that's really beneficial to you. And I don't know about your dogs, but I know when I've walked dogs before, my family dogs, that sometimes you're stop, go, stop, go, stop, go. So you might not be maintaining your heart rate up for as long as you could, or maybe if they slow down, you're not keeping that pace that you should be keeping. So it should be a brisk walk that you're being able to maintain for at least 10 minutes or more, and that gets it into an aerobic exercise. So I hope I helped answer your question today. Basically the vegan diet can be healthy, but to make sure that it's fitting the criteria of the DASH diet to help you lower your blood pressure, I'd be focusing on those key things that I mentioned. Thanks so much.